So we were talking about ways to use off the hump, which usually allows for more controlled multiples, like smaller bits. And I'll talk about that. So I have a larger amount of clay. It's not really, but let's pretend like it is. So this is good for traditionally for lids or spouts.
So you just centered the top, you don't even have to center the whole clump. Okay.
I center as I go for what I need for this shape, and I can do quick multiples from there. So I would take this top part. Now what you don't get sort of allows me to take a smaller amount, and it's easier to center than if I were directly on the wheel. It's kind of got more of an easy ease to it. What's harder to do is compress in the bottom of the hollow form I'm making, because this is a soft base versus a hard base, so it's harder to get good compression into the base. That might result in stress cracks in the bottom. So you have to, there are ways to think about compression differently when you're throwing off the hump, which I can talk about. So once I get the clay that I need centered, I'm going to do a couple of things. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is not related to artifact making per se, but since I'm doing this, I might as well talk about it, which is a good chance to collar like you're making a spout for a teapot. Collaring is external lifting. So what I'm going to do is open this up as a wider groove of space in the base. Now I'm going to run this clay up and in, okay? It's more receding on the inside, more pressure of pushing in against centrifugal force and running the clay up against gravity to make a more cone-like hollow form and get some of this thickness distributed vertically.
I'm going to smack my clay down on the wheel.
Okay,
Sorry, I just think it's going to be loud.
go ahead, thank you. It's fine. Okay, so one thing about, so I'm doing a little lift to get a thinner wall. So one thing you can do to collar clay is your position of your fingers when you're lifting. You know, there's the pinching and pulling, but when you're actually pulling, if your inside hand goes higher than your outside hand, you're wasting the clay. It's like the clay S's between them and you get a narrower profile. It's like a shaping, it's just the position of. So it might look like this. My inside hand is higher. And here's that change in profile. Okay. Now, external lifting, I always want to make sure I have some clay distributed in a thinner wall before I collar, because collaring is thickening the wall. So I don't want to start with a thick wall and then collar, because it'll be too thick to actually get a controlled shape. So it's a faster wheel for collaring. You need a little more force to work against. Your hands can look a lot of different ways, but what I usually do is find 2 to 4 points that are parallel that can come in from the outside and depress to make the ridge, and then I can push it up against gravity. It's usually smaller points of surface to get in there. So it's a faster wheel. I need some more. And then it's a slow hand pushing up. Now I've got something in this wall, like air or something, causing that.
And you prefer not to roughly center the whole thing first?
Sorry?
You prefer not to roughly center the whole thing first?
I might do that another day.
Okay, but you can. Okay, cool. Because normally I center the whole thing. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, but you know, yeah, I would too, maybe, but you don't have to.
Okay.
So now that I've done the collaring, I've thickened the wall. You saw I got nice height here. But the next move is to go back as far as I can reach, or I could use an extension of my fingers, we call it a throwing stick, that can go in to work against. And I want to keep this small. I'm going to do another lift with my inside finger being higher, so as I'm thinning the wall, I'm making a narrower profile like I did before. So it looks like this. Tool this off because there's something in there that's not. Okay, once I do that and I have a thinner wall, I can do another collaring move. Thing, of course, the narrower the form, the more susceptible to being thrown off from the centrifugal force it is. You know, for these moves, I'm using tiny edges of fingernails as points of lifting, not big pads that would put twist or torque in this narrow form. So you're always, when you're throwing, you're thinking of when the clay is solid for centering more surface, and as it becomes more hollow and thin-walled, you have to find less surface in your hands to touch the clay with the intention of thinning the wall. Because too much surface against too thin a form puts a twist and a torque, and you're trying to minimize that as you're moving the clay. Okay, so you get the idea. It would be a series. It depends on really what I'm. And another dangerous activity is trying to use a scraper on this narrow form, but usually what I do is I support the form inside, keep it on center as I very carefully and gently try and change the shape of it from the outside of this rib. Like that. So, collaring is a very specific technique that will expand the vocabulary of wheel thrown parts and shapes and what you can do and how you can do them.
Maybe here's some. Do you want me to give you something to put that on?
Not really. Just gonna put it over here. Thank you, though. So let's talk about now. I'm going to go ahead and center this.
Centered.
Still throwing off the hump. So what Blair and I were talking about is using these small forms and having inventiveness about taking them from the symmetry into asymmetry while they're soft, being able to fold and collapse and use them to generate new forms that live inside of her idea of maybe an organic world or artifacts that had there were parts of bigger things, and it could be anything. And maybe this technique will give you some discovery about what that universe is that you didn't see when you were hand building them. And sometimes we sound like a rhino. Oh, nothing.
Sorry.
Your inside voice was your outside voice for a moment. It's okay. It's all right. I love it. It's like being at the gym when people are grunting, right?
That's better than insult. That's fucked up.
Okay, so I'm just going to open up. So if I were going to keep this like a little dish or a saucer or something, to compensate for the lack of hardness where I would usually compress, you can do compression at the floor line from the outside like your collar and just push in at the floor line to compress it from the side before releasing it from the mouth. Okay, that's something you can do. I'm just pinching in. It just gives a little more compression to that material. Okay. Pretty thick here. Controlled collapsing is such a thing that I always think of one person. You probably all know George Orr. George Orr is the Mad Potter of Biloxi, Mississippi. But I mean, he was so ahead of his time because in the context of when he was making pots, he wasn't interested in the symmetry and the history of pots from the wheel. He was interested in distorting them and the world that he was discovering, the language that he had developed. So he learned how, within the context of what he was doing, to control the collapsing. And it became a term that we can still think of in your own work. It's sort of like not just letting it, just really feeling like you know how the windows of how to have the collapse occur within a window of expectation. Okay, and that's developed over just a trial and error and whatever. So I don't know. I mean, these could be. I'm going to just. So I mean. Things that the clay does when it's really, really wet. This has a little structure today, that's good. Of course, one thing that locks everything into symmetry from the wheel is the bottom, where it's closed. And so later, maybe I wait until this stiffens a little bit.
Because once you've deformed it, distorted it, you can't trim it.
You could trim where it's round, or you could hand carve it.
Hand carve it.
That didn't go very well for me. Hold on. But maybe this is good. I'm just going to take this thing that I wired off. So the wheel is still present in this form. So maybe I'm more interested in that for now than I was when it was just a round dish. Knowing that all the messiness of what I did to handle that with no understanding of what I was doing, there'll be choices to come back in strategically after drying time to make changes that might feel more in my touch again, more in my world again. Instead of it moved away from me, I have to pull it back in. But the excruciating nature of waiting till touching it again, right? Can we talk about that?
I was told go home and relax.
Yeah.
Yeah, about waiting on working on this tree by someone who had to start over because
Not bad advice. I mean, I think
go home.
I think going home and relaxing is a great strategy, but also being in the studio and relaxing is another place to look. And while you're relaxing about one thing, you could be not relaxing about another. That's one thing. That's one very obvious thing is you have multiple projects going, so you don't have to watch something excruciatingly watch ice melt, for instance, right?
Yeah.
We all know about that from other places. So these little moments of starting a certain way and then the boldness to let it go someplace and it feels like, okay, that happened. Knowing that over the course of it changing through dryness, you can put more control back in over layers of touching it.
And you're talking about like when this dries,
Yeah.
like you could carve into it.
Well,
Or-
I could cut it into sections without it changing shape.
Oh,
And then I could cut and paste them back into a new form. It could continue to evolve as a to become building blocks of bigger things, but not this as a whole, but maybe I have to fragment this, but it needs structure before it can hold the fragmentation.
And that would only be like an hour.
On a dry day, it might be 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, all right. So we're talking, you can do all this in one day,
I
in
think
one-
so. I think so.
3 hour, 4 hours,
You know, I think
potentially. Right.
I think some things want to be mapped according to gesture like that, a shorter time frame where there's a sense of a singular gestural move through versus waiting and you come back and life has happened. And, you know, we change
Right.
over the course of a night away from our work in a way that keeps it moving off a different path than it was when we were last here. If you need the path to stay connected, you have to set it up for these gestures that allow you to get it to the milestone where you can leave it and not lose the connection. It's all very subtle and very nuanced and very individual, and it changes according to what you're doing every time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some things can hold us being away on vacation for 2 weeks and coming back and finishing it with a sense of confidence, and some things are lost overnight. And we have to learn how to read the timing of the material and the process, and also our own.
We've been having the same conversation about painting.
Oh yeah?
What to do in one creative burst, what versus hold yourself back and come back when it's dry tomorrow.
I think it's
tricky stuff.
it's tricky.
It's tricky. That's right.
And sometimes it's just like vanilla and chocolate. You know, you choose one, but the other one has merit too, right? It's not that one is better than the
It's
other.
tools.
Yeah.
Tool belt.
But I think in the broader sense of a studio life, let's say over years versus days, you know, it's good to start to be able to pull back from your own world and notice things, and more objectively, like somebody viewing from above, like you're viewing yourself from above, start to notice trends and how, you know, like how do I work best and when am I happy? It could be emotional. When am I feeling the flow more? You might start to see patterns that over time you can work with to stay more in the productive zone, whatever that means, than not. And if it's used that way, I think it's useful. Other times, maybe it's not that useful to think about. Overthink, too. Sometimes you can paralyze yourself with all of these, if I touch it now, if I don't touch it now, that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if all of this goes back in the clay bin, so what? So what?
Yeah.
You know, and I've come to adopt an attitude with all of it. Look, if I'm getting ready for my retrospective at MoMA, I might have a different story to tell about my attachment to how things go. You know what I mean? Like the opening is set. Agnes Gund has got her ticket to the opening, right? She made a ticket, she owns MoMA, whatever. That would make me be very different. And we all have moments like that. And I hope we all have retrospectives at MoMA, but we have similar moments. Mostly though, this stuff, the good stuff, is not dependent on the objects at all. It's about the process of yielding, that yields objects that will change us forever, that will never be able to be taken away from us, that always is foundational for the next thing. So it truly is that way for makers. And sometimes we get distracted by our attachments to how it looks and where it's going to go and will it be sellable, and there's very good compelling reasons why we should care about that. But I have learned to release myself. I've learned how to notice when I'm becoming attached and to talk myself off the ledge of that attachment so that I'm freer to have the work take me somewhere new. It's tricky. It's like Buddhists talk about the middle way. Buddhists talk about the middle way, and they're talking about, you know, we're in the physical world of this planet, and we're also, as spiritual beings, we have to also be there. So we're walking the middle ground between those two things. And I feel like art offers a lot of that same stuff. So what do I need to do with this last piece of clay on the wheel, just to do one more thing?
Plate, right?
What?
What would you like from out to do for the last thing?
my
Make a
God.
plate.
Surprise me.
Surprised you, okay. Why don't I do just a closed form? Why not? Go through that again. Just take a second. So again, I'm thinking about the nature of the form. Do I want it to be a sphere that's round all the way around? In that case, I would set the bottom up to be a bowl instead of a flat bottom.
So when you're pulling up, your inside finger is, I thought the inside finger was always supposed to be above the outside finger, like that.
I'm thinking, well, in this case, I'm setting up the key moments of the form earlier than usual. So I opened a bowl, and I also, in the initial pull, I was taking it back in because I know I don't want to overtouch this clay at the key moment when I'm trying to close it. It needs to be healthy clay. It can't be too wet. So I'm doing more work sooner than I would normally do. So now that I've set up the basic shape, it's like a bowl in the bottom, and it's a kind of starting to be a bowl at the top. I'm going to go ahead and do one more lift to continue to get more volume out of the same material that's in the wall. So I'm trying to just really bring out more and trying to keep the opening smaller. This
So
is
when you lifted it, you were going out and then you came back in. Okay.
So I'm just doing a little compressive work before I close it in too much on the floor, setting up the floor. Okay. So now it's very helpful to me to do one more focusing on the material on the base, which I still have quite a bit in the bottom fifth of this. Okay, so I'm now going to focus on getting this closed, and what it's helpful for me is to have a vertical part right here. That's something to grab to help me take it in against a slower wheel. I'm going to support, it's a certain kind of lifting where my inside finger is ahead of my outside finger, and it's also establishing the upward arch. And I'm pushing the clay I'm pushing it in against centrifugal force. So it's lifting up toward gravity and it's pushing in centrifugal force on the outside. So now I'm really pushing this vertical piece of clay. I'm running it against my finger that's supporting underneath to get the opening closed. And again, the point that I'm using to move the clay is more like the edge of a fingernail or just the corner here. That's how much surface I'm using. More of most of the work is being done with the outside finger, not the inside. So this might be a time to go back and collar this part to really do external lifting, to really move it in. So edges, because this is really thin and wet, so I can't have too much surface area. I'm going to go in and kind of thin the wall and push it in at the same time. Oops. That plate is so weak, so I'm just going to pencil that off. So every time I make it heavier here, relation to here, you're gonna see some structural stuff happening that like, so I have to kind of really make sure this is always lighter on top relative to what's happening below, or it'll collapse or become.
So cute, just like that.
Yeah,
A little bud face.
little bud face, huh? I know.
Goodbye, bud face.
Well, we'll see. Clay is really, really weak now. So it's a little weak here, which is not terribly unusual. So once I have the air trapped inside, it gives me some leeway to really kind of compress and maybe do a little shape changing on the outside. I use these closed forms. What I like about them in the language of building from real parts is they can be reopened in other places later. You know, I mean, I'm not locked into the opening as a part of continuing a stack that's symmetrical. I could open them up and they can become parts of other more complicated hollow forms more easily. It's sort of a very particular part of the vocabulary of building a sculptural thing from the wheel to have a closed form that I really enjoy working with. Okay, same deal. Just like with the donut, I'm going to just trim a little.
That's right here.
Always goes missing. Take away all that excess. Fit it all there now. Just the edge. Okay. Not the most beautiful shape. Wheel world.
It's awesome.
It's such